on a small Greek island in the Aegean Sea. An event in the first century marked the history of Christianity. The Apostle John was sent into exile on the island of Patmos several decades after the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The apostle had a unique experience that would change him forever. Deep in a cave, he received a vision of the resurrected Christ, who revealed himself and gave John a message to transcribe in the famous book of Revelation. The visions and prophecies contained in this book reveal an all-out spiritual war that unleashes the forces of evil against believers in the end times. The text begins with a series of letters to 7 churches in the first century's Asia Minor. What was the significance of these messages? And were they ready to hear them? Deeply intrigued by this revelation, I decided to investigate these mysterious churches of Revelation. What do they represent? From the first centuries, this revelation became a source of new hope for Christians who were marginalized and oppressed by the Roman imperial power. During my trip, I will travel to the island of Patmos in the Aegean Sea. Then I will continue to Turkey, the land of the churches of the Revelation, to the ancient Roman cities of Ephesus, Smyrna, and Pergamon. What was it like for the first Christians living in these cities? How far were they willing to go to follow Christ? I will seek to understand the relevance of these letters to them and to us today. Can this message still impact the lives of millions of believers? What encouragement does it have for those who are willing to go through times of fire? My journey begins on the island of Patmos in Greece. The island is located among the Dodecanese Islands off the coast of Turkey in the Aegean Sea. After several hours by plane and by ferry, I arrived at my destination. The island of Patmos is a beautiful, small, mountainous, and arid island, 12 kilometers long, preserved away from the hustle and bustle of the modern world. The island is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Beyond its peaceful charm, this island contains secrets that only the most well-informed know of. That's why I'm going to meet Professor Mark Wilson at his hotel in front of the port of Scala. Renowned historian and author of numerous publications, Mark is considered one of the world's leading specialists in Patmos and the 7 churches of Revelation.
Well, we're on a lovely Greek island called Patmos that today is about 60 kilometers off the coast of Turkey. But in the first century when John was here, this was part of the Roman province of Asia. Well, apart from the New Testament, Patmos really is not mentioned very often in ancient sources. So it's sort of a forgotten island, but because it's mentioned in Revelation 1:9, all Christians around the world know the importance of this island and its significance for the book of Revelations.
The island is considered to be sacred. It's home to more than 500 churches spread across its terrain. The oldest and probably the most impressive on the island is the Monastery of St. John. With its dark color and fortress-like appearance, it overlooks the island and contrasts with the white facades of the small town of Korah.
The monastery was built in 1088 by Saint Christodule. The Byzantine emperor of the time, Alexis I Comnene, offered him the island of Patmos in its entirety to build a monastery he also financed.
It is in the monastery's church that I find the most obvious traces of the presence of the Apostle John on the island. The whole church is adorned with ornaments and icons, as well as magnificent frescoes that cover the walls and the exterior facade. They show John baptizing the faithful and exercising his ministry on the island. Most of the frescoes of the apostle depict him accompanied by his disciple Prochorus, who followed him into exile from Jerusalem.
Now we know that prisoners often were accompanied by attendants or by slaves, so it's very possible that John did not come alone. And the traditions that we see on icons here are when John received the revelation, he dictated it to Prochorus, who wrote down the revelations of Jesus Christ.
But what exactly were the reasons for John's exile on this remote island? From the beginning of Christianity, shortly after the crucifixion of Christ, the first apostles and founders of the church, including the Apostle John, were oppressed by the Roman authorities while trying to survive and spread their faith.
The Apostle John arrived in Patmos as an exile. He was deported by the Romans.
The Romans would exile political prisoners to islands all throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. The book of Revelation really doesn't tell us specifics about how he came here. He says that he's on the island because of the Word of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ. And he identifies himself as a brother and companion in the suffering.
The book of Revelation is set in a context of persecution, and John declares, "I, John, your brother, who share like you in the present distress." So there is a difficult time for all the churches, for all Christianity at that time.
It was during the 1st century that Christendom experienced its first period of significant persecution. Nero was the first emperor to have Christians massacred, including the apostles Peter and Paul, murdered in Rome in 65 AD. A few years later, there was a great uprising in Israel. In 70 AD, Israel was besieged by the Romans. General Titus massacred the inhabitants in a bloodbath and destroyed the temple, forcing the Jews into exile.
Here we have a period in church history when the Christians have just been persecuted in Rome. We also have a Jew coming from the war zone in Jerusalem there, arriving in Ephesus. So a very tumultuous period in history. And so with the political instability, I think if I was a Roman governor, I would like to get this leader out of the way for a period of time until the political and religious situation settles down.
In Patmos, the monastery of St. John becomes particularly intriguing, but we know that it hosts a mysterious library in its depths. Few people have the privilege of entering it. Fortunately, a local contact on the island has got me permission to access the underground of the monastery, thus opening the doors of this unique place. This library contains in its depths infinitely precious and carefully preserved work, including several thousand-year-old manuscripts. Among them is the oldest known copy of the Gospel of Mark, the Codex Purpureus. This 5th century document is one of the oldest illuminated manuscripts in the world. Giannis, the library curator, takes meticulous care in showing me this precious artifact. The existence of this unique collection reveals how important the island of Patmos is for the Christian Orthodox world. From the Byzantine era to the end of the 19th century, several hundred manuscripts were collected here, making this the oldest and one of the most extensive libraries dedicated to the Byzantine period. But the most sacred place on the island is located on one of the slopes of the hill where the monastery of St. John is erected. This bright white building houses the famous Cave of Revelation, in which John and his disciple may have found refuge during the 2 years of their captivity.
Well, there are a number of caves on the island, and certainly John would have had to have shelter somewhere during the time when it's cold, when it's raining here on the island. And the cave might have been a place not only of shelter, but of spiritual retreat, where he could pray, he could meditate. It is very likely that the tradition is correct that John was in this cave when he received his revelation.
The first thing you notice on going down into the cave is that it has been made into a place of Orthodox worship. The building is attached to the rock wall.
The natural part of the cave comes to marry with the divine part of the holy monastery. You can see, and it is impressive, the place where John the theologian laid his head to rest, as well as a small cavity where he put his hand to get up or kneel to pray. There is also the place of the tear in the rock in 3 parts that symbolizes the Trinity of God. This is where John's student, Procol, posed to write everything John told him.
It is here that John received his revelation. First, he heard a powerful voice behind him, similar to a trumpet. Then the risen Christ himself appeared to him in all his glory, shining like the noonday sun. The book of Revelation describes that scene in detail. Then I turned to see the voice that spoke with me, and having turned I saw 7 golden lampstands, and in the midst of the 7 lampstands, one like the Son of Man, clothed with a garment down to the feet, and girded about the chest with a golden band. His head and hair were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes like a flame of fire. His feet were like fine brass, as if refined in a furnace, and his voice as the sound of many waters. He had in his right hand 7 stars. Out of his mouth went a sharp 2-edged sword, and his countenance was like the sun shining in its strength. When he saw Christ, the apostle fell at his feet as if dead, aware that the risen Lord was speaking to him personally. But he laid his right hand on me, saying, "Do not be afraid." John is terrified. The vision shows Christ in the middle of 7 golden lampstands, holding 7 stars in his right hand. His powerful voice then resounds, "What you see, write it in a book, and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus, to Smyrna, to Pergamon, to Thyatira, to Sardis, to Philadelphia, and to Laodicea." The message of this vision is full of imagery. But what do these 7 lampstands represent, and why speak to these 7 churches?
Jesus is in the middle of these 7 lampstands. He is dressed as the high priest. These 7 candlesticks, which are the 7 churches, are examined by the Lord to see if they are worthy of being lit or not.
They appear in the first 2 chapters of Revelation. So they constitute the audience to which the author addresses. All these visions from chapter 3 are intended for the believers of these churches. It is like presenting the audience.
These congregations were all in Asia Minor, in the western part of modern-day Turkey.
We can see that these 7 churches constitute like a crown geographically around the great metropolis of Ephesus. We have here an alliance of communities.
These churches are very real. They lived here 2,000 years ago. They had their problems, their difficulties, their questions, their missteps, etc. On the other hand, they had to be a quorum of 7 because of the symbolic nature of the 7 that is found throughout the Revelation.
Why have we kept these 7 letters and why are there no others? Because it's symbolic. In a way, when we made a list of 7, we said it all. We could do more, but it would not add anything because everything is already said.
7, it is the number of fullness. So the 7 churches represent the universal church. It is the church of all places and all times.
In the different characteristics, strengths, and weaknesses of these churches, we must also find our own. And therefore the diagnosis and solutions of Jesus must impact us today.
Christ's intention was to point out their true spiritual state. He encouraged some churches, but exhorted others to take a good look at themselves or radically change their attitude.
Some of them are strong in their faith, others are weak in their faith, and some are kind of in between. They're, as we say, straddling the fence. And Jesus, through John, is trying to pull them over and to be full followers of Jesus Christ.
Looking out over Patmos, I realized this small, remote Mediterranean island played a key role in the history of humanity. During his exile, John the Apostle must have looked at this same scenery every evening while thinking about the revelation God had entrusted him and the heavy responsibility to share its message with the 7 churches in Asia Minor. But what he may not have known was that beyond these churches, the prophetic text would impact all generations of believers. When he was finally released from exile, the old apostle settled in the metropolis of Ephesus on the other side of the Aegean Sea. That's where he would continue to spread his message. So for my next stop, I will follow his footsteps to Turkey. The ferry takes me to Kuşadası, a large coastal town near the archaeological site of Ephesus. My first stop will be the town of Selçuk, inland, to visit a basilica I am particularly interested in. Behind these powerful fortifications is an ancient Byzantine basilica, the Basilica of St. John. According to tradition, it was erected on the tomb of the apostle.
In its initial phase, it was a simple tomb that was in a necropolis or cemetery there in the area. And the local Christians maintained the traditions that John was buried here. We see this tradition very early arising, and we see Christian pilgrims coming very early to visit Ephesus and to see the tomb of John.
When John came to the city towards the end of the 1st century, Ephesus was already home to a large Christian community, founded by the Apostle Paul years earlier.
Ephesus was really the apostolic center because it's also the political center of the province. So this would be the natural place for John to live and to, in a sense, take over the work of the Apostle Paul in the province and continue to lead the churches in the province of Asia.
An ancient baptistry still stands there as a witness to that distant period when new converts to Christianity were baptized. John was the bishop of the churches of Asia Minor. He thus had the authority to share the vision and Christ's message at the church in Ephesus. But what was that message? The letter to the church in Ephesus begins with encouragement. I know your deeds, your hard work, and your perseverance. You have endured hardships for my name and have not grown weary.
We know that the Ephesian church was resisting false teaching. We see this in Paul's letters. There was a lot of heretical teaching about practices that he's combating there.
The text is very complimentary to this church. She has perseverance and discernment, she has sustained, she is able to discern false apostles.
But the text goes on to be highly critical. Yet I hold this against you. You have forsaken the love you had at first. The church has braved hostility, even suffered for Christ. But at the time of the book of Revelation, Christ reprimands it for having lost its first love of him. What a very mysterious paradox. This text perplexes me. What opposition did the church face in its early days? And above all, what is this loss of love referred to in the Revelation all about? Ephesus was once a large and thriving city on the coast of the Roman province of Asia Minor. The sea used to reach as far as the port via a canal that is now blocked. That is how Ephesus had such influence across the Aegean Sea. The archaeological site is located not far from the basilica, a few hundred meters away. Today, the beauty of the ancient site of Ephesus is a clear indication of the grandeur and opulence it enjoyed in its peak. In the 1st century, this city was of equal importance to Alexandria, even to Rome, the imperial capital. It was the political and religious center of Asia Minor at the time. Ephesus was a bustling city, a cultural, commercial, and religious crossroads, buzzing with activities. Its port hosted many ships that came to carry goods from all over the Roman Empire. It had huge public buildings, an enormous theater, a library, and a temple that is considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Temple of Artemis of Ephesus.
Ephesus was the most important city in the province of Asia during the time of the early church. Because of its strategic location, Ephesus was a perfect place for the gospel to go forth.
It was precisely because of this that the Apostle Paul settled in Ephesus during the period of his missionary journeys. Paul of Tarsus is the major figure in the spread of Christianity among the non-Jews and the most abundant author of the New Testament.
Well, Paul is really the apostle who lays the foundation of the gospel in the province of Asia.
Paul arrived in Ephesus around 52 AD, and he chose Ephesus as his missionary base. That was his strategy, to pick large cities.
He stayed there for over 3 years. Acts chapter 19 recounts that period in detail and tells how, through Paul, the gospel changed this region. My first step will give me an important clue about Paul's time here. I I stand in front of the iconic facade of the Library of Celsus. The impressive building dates from 117 AD. Over half of the fragments of the original were found, and it has been beautifully restored.
The library is known as the third largest library in the ancient world, after that of Alexandria and Pergamon. At the time, it was the only place where you could read something. People did not have a private library, so it was open to the public, and people came to read the documents on site.
It housed more than 12,000 scrolls lodged in recesses embedded in its walls. As I climb the steps of the library, an important symbol catches my eye. A 7-branched candelabra called the menorah. This is clear proof that there was a Jewish community in Ephesus. We know from the book of Acts that Paul, as a Jew, spoke in synagogues when he arrived in a new city.
He begins in the synagogue, which he does in many cities where there is a Jewish population. We know in Ephesus there was a substantial Jewish community.
The method of evangelization is always the same. His first step when he arrives in a new city is to go to the synagogue of the place. In general, this goes pretty badly after a while. So Paul is forced to leave the synagogue and create a structure next door, which is going to be the church.
Paul entered the synagogue and spoke boldly there for 3 months, arguing persuasively about the kingdom of God. But some of them became obstinate. They refused to believe, so Paul left them. He had discussions daily in the lecture hall of Tyrannus. This went on for 2 years, so that all the Jews and Greeks who lived in the province of Asia heard the word of the Lord. People of all walks of life would come and listen to the apostle preaching the resurrected Christ. For around 3 years, Paul went all out, often preaching late into the night.
He did many miracles during this time. He did exorcisms, and all of this is described in Acts chapter 19. And so he had great favor with the community there. And during his time in Ephesus, the gospel radiated out throughout the province of Asia.
Many were convinced by Paul's preaching to the extent that it caused uproar among those who worshipped Artemis. For as we know, when Paul was there, Ephesus was a hub of paganism and the occult. Many Greek and Roman gods were venerated, but the main goddess of the city was Artemis of Ephesus, to whom a huge sanctuary was dedicated. You only need to visit Selçuk Museum a few steps away to understand the scale of devotion to Artemis at the time. The huge marble statue has been preserved, and we can see it on show in a room set aside for it. The statue is a masterpiece, nearly 9.5 feet tall. Artemis, or Diana, her Roman name, was the goddess of the wilderness and hunting.
The cult of Artemis was the cult of a fertility goddess. The Artemisium, the temple of Artemis, is very famous throughout the Eastern Mediterranean.
The goddess is depicted in tight-fitting attire decorated with many species of animals representing fertility.
These are representations of statues with lots of breasts all over the body. It sounds curious, but it's a kind of paroxysm of the highest point of what is a cult of fertility.
Small, miniature reproductions of the temple facade and the statue of Artemis have been found almost throughout all of the Mediterranean basin.
So many people traveled to Ephesus, of course, for the special services related to the Temple of Artemis.
It is therefore a place of pilgrimage that attracts pilgrims from the whole empire. And they left with these small terracotta reproductions.
To assert the sovereignty of the goddess in the city, The Ephesians had instituted a sacred fire in the place called the Prytanea. This fire was never to be extinguished. The priest responsible for its care risked being burned alive should the fire go out. There were hundreds of priests, eunuchs, musicians, custodians, and magicians who initiated followers into secret rituals, offered sacrifices, and paraded in huge mystical processions in honor of Artemis. A whole month of the year was dedicated to the goddess and given over to her bacchanalian revelry to celebrate Artemis of Ephesus. Pilgrims from all over the Greek world would attend orgastic festivals and initiation rituals in her honor. It was the most visited temple in the whole of Asia Minor. It was against this pagan backdrop that the Apostle Paul began to preach the gospel. Nowadays, it is not pilgrims coming to worship Artemis that flood the city, but tourists visiting the site in their thousands every day. As I make my way through this crowd, I'm aware of the opportunity this gave Paul. He used the temple of Artemis to his advantage. He preached the gospel to pilgrims from all over the empire who came to celebrate feasts in honor of the goddess Artemis. This caused Jews and pagans to gradually convert to Christianity.
The goddess of Artemis in Ephesus bumps into Paul, who comes to preach faith in Jesus Christ. So obviously the difference between these two types of beliefs and the two purposes is still quite strong. So Paul preaches to different backgrounds that come from extremely different cultures.
The message of the gospel is bringing a different ethical standard. The treatment of slaves, for example, that Paul is talking about, of loving one another, the use of money that Paul is teaching in terms of stewardship, all of these elements of the gospel were very different than the cultural and political milieu of Asia Minor at this time.
Seeing the power behind Paul's miracles, a number of people who had been involved in witchcraft brought their scrolls and burned them publicly. The book of Acts talks about the books being worth 50,000 drachmas, a fortune equivalent to millions of dollars today.
There had been an extraordinary awakening where there were setups of life, so much so that the occult arts present at Ephesus had been abandoned.
But Paul had already convinced a large group of people to change their allegiance by saying that man-made gods were not gods but idols. He had such success that the number of pilgrims going to the temple decreased.
It is obvious that Christianity takes full brunt of the pagan cults, which are associated with an important mercantilism. There is a whole sacred trade that takes place around this city.
The silversmiths who are selling their souvenirs to the pilgrims who come into the city are upset because of the preaching of Paul. And of course, they're losing business. They're losing sales to these pilgrims who are coming in.
The Acts of the Apostles in chapter 19 recount, in an absolutely incredible episode, the summoning by Demetrius of his colleagues in the congregation of goldsmiths.
Demetrius, a key leader of this group, called the craftsmen together to stir them up against Paul. Thus, he became the spokesman for this large-scale protest movement, which spilled over into the whole city.
He realized that after a few years his trade was failing, and he made Paul and the Christians absolutely responsible.
And so they used the occasion now to bring opposition against Paul and to accuse him then of demeaning the status of Artemis. And as a result, the riot takes place, and this large crowd goes into the theater that's close to the commercial agora there.
The semicircular theater could hold 25,000 people. So, in the midst of utter confusion, these people came together to listen to Demetrius' speech. He easily succeeded in convincing the crowd, who then became unanimous in their defense of the goddess Artemis.
And we have now this mob for 2 hours shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians."
The riot was suddenly directed against Christians and Jews, as the Ephesians did not make any distinction between these two belief systems. Paul wanted to appear before the crowd, but his companions discouraged him to prevent him being attacked by supporters of Artemis. The issue was resolved when the city clerk arrived.
In Ephesus, there was one very important thing. The city had the title of City near Colossus, a city that had a temple. So an officer arrives during this revolt in the theater, and he told the people to shut up, to stop this revolt. If they continue like this, we're going to lose our title. If you have a problem with Paul, you can go to the judge, there are courts, and then elsewhere, but not here in this theater.
The city clerk dismissed everyone. The crowd calmed down and dispersed. Because of this opposition, Paul had to leave the city and decided to set off for Greece to continue his missionary work there. For Ephesus and its temple, this marked the beginning of a long decline and gradual dwindling in interest. The port of Ephesus was in a lagoon which gradually silted up, depriving it of its vital access to the sea and the source of its prosperity. So the city lost its prestige. Ephesus never recovered and was eventually completely abandoned over the ensuing centuries. But let's get back to Revelation. In the same way that the Ephesians abandoned this prestigious city, in a letter to the church in Ephesus, John the Apostle draws a parallel, noting that the church is in decline and has abandoned its first love. And yet all this church's history reveals that it had started out so well. So what happened for it to lose its love of God?
The Church of Ephesus is in a way the type of evolution of a church that started well and ends badly. She therefore abandoned her first love.
We don't necessarily have to see an unresponsive church. It may be a church that is still very active, but has forgotten why it had to be active.
One senses that Jesus himself regrets so much that the affection of this church for him has diminished. He says, "You don't love me like you used to." Finally, the consequence of this lack of love for the Lord is a consequence which carries its logical course. Since you move away from me, you lose the blessing.
Therefore, the Lord is looking for a new encounter with the people of this church that marked this awakening that is described to us in the books of Acts. By the time Paul arrives at Ephesus, may once again become a present reality.
We're talking about a church that has perseverance, discernment, that does many things. But is she going to lose the heart, the soul of all of this? The living relationship with this God who loves her, who saved her. He gives us His Spirit. And so that's really the challenge, to say, is this still a relationship? And that is what threatens us. We see how in a believer's life, and even a committed believer, it is easy to start talking about God and stop talking to God.
My time in Ephesus is coming to an end. This city was the site of strong opposition when the gospel appeared. However, the missionary work that Paul and John carried out within this young church soon caused a tremendous expansion of Christianity in the Roman world. But the disruption brought here by the gospel was just a foretaste of the major political upheaval that the first Christians would have to face. The next church mentioned in Revelation, Smyrna, will show me just how strongly the almighty imperial Rome will react and oppose what it considered a new sect from Judaism. Will the Christian faith disappear under the weight of oppression? Or, to the contrary, will it spread with even more fervor? Now my road leads me to the city of Izmir. Located about 50 miles north of Ephesus, the city of Smyrna has become the great Aegean metropolis of Izmir. It is the third largest Turkish city after Istanbul and Ankara. It is Turkey's second port. It is a bustling modern city, the one most westernized and most influenced by Europe and modern Turkey. Its residents are as hospitable as they are friendly. In ancient times, under Roman occupation, Smyrna was a prestigious city in Asia Minor, and its port grew in importance to the detriment of that of Ephesus, which gradually silted up.
It was a port town founded there after the time of Alexander the Great. And it was renowned again throughout the Roman Empire as being a type of an intellectual city. It was noted as the traditional home of Homer.
It was in direct competition with its neighbors Ephesus and Pergamon for political and economic power.
And these cities competed for civic honors. Who is the first and the greatest city in the province of Asia? So between Ephesus, Smyrna, and Pergamum,
in the text of Revelation, the letter to Smyrna warns the church that difficult times lie ahead and that its faith will be severely tested. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown.
there's no words of blame. There's no problems because of this issue of persecution. So Jesus is encouraging them to continue through the time of persecution that they're experiencing.
The Smyrna church is going to experience a 10 days tribulation. It is not something to be taken literally. It means that it is going to experience very serious persecution.
The letter to Smyrna is very intriguing. What exactly would these persecutions be? What dramatic events will transpire for the Christians of Smyrna? I begin my investigation here at the Agora in Smyrna. This place is the only real archaeological excavation site in the city of Izmir. The Agora was the administrative and commercial heart in antiquity, and it is here that the best preserved remains of the city were discovered.
In antiquity, when cities were founded, there was a square in the center, an empty space. We built around the public establishments necessary for the city, and this place, which was called the Agora, became the center of the ancient cities. Shops and public establishments were located here. Many activities, such as fairs and festivals, made these agoras the place of socialization.
This was the heart of the city of Smyrna in ancient times, but over the following centuries, during the Byzantine period, Insecurity and threats of Arab invasions prompted residents to move nearer to the port, to areas of the city that offered better protection. The Agra and Old Town gradually declined in importance and ultimately became a cemetery. This change in attitude towards the Agra explains why we now find gravestones and tombs linked to various religious beliefs here. This cemetery enabled ancient remains to be preserved and deterred people from erecting new buildings. Several of these tombs are decorated with a six-pointed star, representing the Star of David. These Jewish tombs are evidence of the presence of a Jewish community in Smyrna in ancient times.
Sources indicate that there was a Jewish community. Then, there was within this community the emergence, as was always the case, of a Christian community.
So important to remember that the core of all these early Christian communities are Jews who are followers of Jesus. So they are the first ones who have believed in many of these cities, because see Paul going into the synagogue first and preaching, and there will always be some of the Jews in the synagogues who become followers of Jesus.
We see that at the time of the apocalypse, we begin to have a separation which lasted for centuries between Judaism, which did not choose Christ, and Judaism, which followed Christ and allied with the pagans who became Christians. So we have the growing church and Judaism as we know it today.
So up to this point, the followers of Jesus were believed to be a sect of the Jews. And it's at this time now that the separation within the Roman thinking between the Jews and the followers of Jesus began. And I think we see this in the book of Revelation as well, with the language in the letters to Smyrna and Philadelphia of synagogue of Satan.
A verse in the letter to Smyrna says, "I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan." Why does Revelation associate Satan with Jewish communities who were hostile to new Christian believers? And what was the origin of these tensions? And what exactly does the phrase synagogue of Satan mean?
Synagogue, etymologically, it means the place where we gather. It is the gathering of those who are with Satan.
This text has often been used by Christian anti-Semitism since the days of the Church Fathers. But when you take it into context, you realize that it doesn't apply at all to the Jewish community that there might be right here in Smyrna.
Unfortunately, Christians have used texts like this in anti-Semitic ways. And so we must carefully distinguish that this is not the intent of this.
When you realize that we are not facing a Christian church that appeared from nothing and Judaism that continued as if nothing had happened, but that we are rather on two branches of the same tree, then you understand this fight. It is violent because we are never as violent as when it touches us intimately.
So this tension now is growing within the Jewish communities about, what to do, with this group of Jesus followers. Now the pushing out of Jesus followers from the synagogue, from the Jewish communities here, and this is what is being addressed by John here.
So for the Apostle John, the synagogue of Satan refers to the group of Jews opposing Christians and accusing them before Roman authorities of not being true Jews. But when he talks about the suffering that the Church of Smyrna will have to endure, what is he really alluding to? What was really at stake for Christians detaching themselves from Judaism? We first need to understand that Jews enjoyed special dispensation in the Roman Empire.
The Roman Empire was a relatively tolerant empire, provided that the conquered people added to their pantheon the emperor, the cult of the emperor, and the goddess Roma.
In Smyrna, as in Ephesus and Pergamon, citizens worshipped the emperor. They venerated Roman emperors and the goddess Roma, who was over all the goddesses of the city of Rome as gods.
We have the imperial cult temples there in these three major cities, again, for the Greek residents. They are to offer up worship, incense to the emperor as a Lord and God. And so this was part of the reality of living in these cities in the first century.
This was obviously something that was unacceptable to the Jewish people, and the Jewish people had been exempted from this obligation, provided that they offered in their temple not sacrifices to the emperor, but sacrifices for the health of the emperor.
This was very important, as it would have a dramatic effect on the early Christian communities from the beginning of the 2nd century.
From the moment the Roman Empire realized that Christians were not what they had thought, that is to say, a branch of Judaism, Christians were no longer covered by the consensus that had been granted to the Jews, so they found themselves under an obligation to worship the emperor.
This explains the dramatic situation in Smyrna. It meant that Christians were confronted with a terrible dilemma. Would they deny the emperor, or would they deny Christ?
One of the things that the provincial governors would try and do with the Christians is have them offer sacrifice to the genius of the emperor and to confess him as Lord and God. When they would refuse to do that, sometimes persecution resulted and even death.
So their position started to become extremely difficult. Christians were perceived as being antisocial and rebellious towards the established order. Rome began hounding these dissidents and unleashing persecution.
Well, until the time of Constantine, of course, we had various persecutions in the church. We had these waves of persecution in which many Christians died.
A tragic event made the situation even worse. In 63 AD, a fire that raged for several days destroyed a large part of Rome, the capital of the empire. It was a terrible tragedy that claimed thousands of lives.
And there were rumors that circulated, according to which it was the Emperor Nero himself who had ordered Rome to be set on fire.
Witnesses said that they had seen Nero playing the fiddle while Rome burned behind him. He was said to have set the city on fire in order to destroy the older districts so that he could rebuild Rome to his liking.
These are the rumors. Whether or not it was ultimately he who set Rome on fire, historians are discussing that.
To silence these rumors, Nero accused Christians and had them tortured, calling the Christian religion an evil new superstition.
Nero looks for someone to blame this fire on, and the Christians become a very convenient scapegoat, and so this great persecution takes place.
In the direction of the current Vatican, he had created 2 rows of crosses on which Christians were crucified. Coated with pitch, he had lit them like living torches, and he passed in his chariot between these 2 rows of Christians playing the lyre. That also inspired him for his literary and artistic works.
This was the backdrop to the emergence of martyrs, Christians preferring to be killed as a testimony to their faith, rather than renounce their beliefs. They chose to die horrendous deaths and were made a spectacle of. An event that marked history then took place in Smyrna. It was here that St. Polycarp, a disciple of the Apostle John and one of the first bishops of the Church of Smyrna, was martyred. I crossed the town of Izmir to get to the church bearing his name. The building seems quite modest compared to the others around it. I'm due to meet the Archbishop of Izmir, Lorenzo Peretto. a former Dominican friar of Italian origin, an expert on the history of his illustrious predecessor, Bishop Polycarp.
Polycarp was the Bishop of Izmir. He was a disciple of the apostles, especially St. John. Maybe he knew him early in his life. He was still young. It is believed that he was born around the year 70. The Apostle John was already old, but he lived in this region. We actually think they got to know each other well.
There's a tradition that Polycarp had this link with John, and around 110 AD, we know he's already the bishop of Smyrna. He was a very influential leader of the early church in Western Asia Minor in the 2nd century.
The church interior is magnificent. Frescoes depicting the life of St. Polycarp decorate the whole of the vaulted ceiling.
Polycarp, as the bishop of Smyrna, was in a very difficult situation at the end of his life. There was opposition in the city of Smyrna against him. There was the beginning of persecution against the Christians.
He was persecuted on the denunciation of the Jews of the place. There was a conflict at that time between the Jews and then the Christian community. And Polycarp, being therefore the main representative, he was denounced to the Roman authorities.
Polycarp was warned by the disciples to flee the city of Smyrna, but he feels like he should return. And he appears before the governor, and the governor offers him his life. He says, "You're an old man, save yourself. All you have to do is offer incense to the emperor, and then you'll live." And Polycarp gives one of the most important confessions in Christian faith ever. He says, "For 86 years I've served the Lord, and he's done me no wrong. How can I forsake the Lord who saved me?"
He was meant to be burned alive, but the flames did not touch him, so they took swords.
And then he is stuck with a sword into his side, and Polycarp dies.
Everyone sang praises to God. It was a kind of glorification of Polycarp, his martyr.
Polycarp died as a faithful martyr to Christ. His death was not an isolated act, as many Christians suffered the same terrible fate afterward.
If you read Revelation saying to yourself, at least one or the other church is being persecuted, this is proof that Revelation is a book to console persecuted Christians, saying to them, wait, it will soon be resolved. Read the letter to Smyrna seriously. It is said to them, the one who will be faithful until death. They are not going to be spared, any more than Jesus was spared.
The justice of God necessarily implies justice in the afterlife, because our present world is a totally, intrinsically unjust world. But there is a righteousness from God and a retribution from God which is inscribed in eternity.
What I'm telling you, the good news is that death will not have the last word. It is that to die for the truth, for a world which does not allow itself to be perverted by this evil spirit, that is the real victory.
Faithful unto death? The question is quite disturbing. If I too were to face violence and persecution, would I be prepared to lose my freedom in order to keep my religious beliefs? Observing the people strolling in the clock tower square of Izmir, I realize that I have no idea what my answer would be. The letter to the church in Smyrna encourages us to not fear suffering and death, because it offers a greater hope and justice in the hereafter. The letter to the church in Smyrna opened my eyes to the oppression of the early Christians. But it doesn't end there. The next letter in the Revelation to Pergamon goes even further. My next step will be to discover the real spiritual issues that were hiding behind the intense persecution. I'm heading to the small town of Bergama, located 100 kilometers north of Izmir. In ancient times, this is where Pergamon was enthroned, the mighty city to which the third letter of the book of Revelation was addressed. Pergamon looks to be an important milestone on my investigation. Persecution there was incredibly strong. There were some very strange and mysterious occult-like activities going on in the city. The letter addressed to the Church of Pergamon is probably the most intriguing so far. I know your works and the place where you are established. There is the throne of Satan. You are firmly attached to my name, and you have not denied faith in me, even during the days when Antipas, my faithful witness, was put to death in your home where Satan is established. This letter surprisingly proclaims that the seat of Satan's power was in this city. What is it referring to?
One wonders, is there really somewhere on earth a place where there would be the devil's capital? This is a little curious.
The letter also mentions a martyr by the name of Antipas who was put to death where Satan dwells. So, who was Antipas? And what is the connection between his death and the throne of Satan quoted in the text?
Antipas, as the only martyr, was probably a leader in the church there, and as a result of probably an order from the provincial governor, he's killed.
Christian tradition says that Antipas' prayers drove out demons and disrupted pagan rituals that were celebrated in the city. Pagan priests complained about this to the Roman governor, who ordered Antipas to offer an incense sacrifice in front of the statue of Emperor Domitian. Antipas refused to do so. He was condemned to a brutally agonizing death. It is said that he was burned alive inside of a metal bowl over a fire, causing the screams of this poor martyr to echo from within the metal monster. This gruesome story shows that witchcraft was at the heart of their pagan rituals and made this city a very dangerous place for Christians. Here I am with Bergama in front of me. Built on a mountain overlooking the small Turkish town, Pergamos Acropolis is one of the most impressive archaeological sites in Turkey. An amazing architectural achievement. This place of power must have been incredible in ancient times.
Pergamum was a very important fortress city after the time of Alexander the Great. It became the seat then of the Attalid Empire that ruled for about 150 years. So they built this beautiful city on top of the Acropolis. It was a very important and wealthy city. And the final king of this empire, Attalus III, gave his kingdom to the Romans.
the Romans made Pergamon the first capital of Asia before moving the center of power to Ephesus. Pergamon was an extremely emblematic city, strong and powerful. It had huge political and religious influence. The city of Bergama was built on the old lower city of Pergamon. Excavation sites therefore focus on non-urbanized places. The only remnant that can be found in the heart of the city is an ancient Roman temple with gigantic dimensions. We do not know for which gods it was originally erected, although it was probably dedicated to the worship of the Egyptian gods Isis and Serapis, with rituals whose mystery remains concealed behind its huge walls. Later in the 5th century, the temple became a Christian basilica during the Byzantine period. I remain perplexed by the greatness and strangeness of this place, which affirms the importance given to the pagan deities at the time in this city. But another, very famous place of worship in ancient times was located in Pergamon. This is the Asclepion, a center of ancient medicine and worship to the god Asclepius. Located outside the city, a Roman road linked this huge therapy center to the city of Pergamon. It was famous throughout the empire, and the emperor himself would come for treatment here. The Asclepion was a particularly mysterious place, as it combined traditional medicine with magic and psychiatry. It was here that thousands of people came to seek the god Asclepius for healing from their illnesses. Asclepius was depicted with a rod in his hand, around which a serpent is wrapped.
So the snake is a very important symbol related to the healing centers of the Asclepion. There are various treatments, and one of them was like dream therapy and sort of hypnosis, and people would get visions of snakes coming. Yeah, they would have priests, doctors there who would be there, and they would, sort of ancient therapists, who would ask the patients there to tell them the dreams, and then they would interpret them.
The touch of sacred snakes on the sick, whether in dream or in reality, was then interpreted by the priest as the healing touch of the god Asclepius.
Serpent worship was widespread in the ancient East as the very image of healing, restoration, eternal life. Why did the snake symbolize this, when it actually has a negative image and is a dangerous animal? Simply because in ancient times, people believed it was rejuvenated every time it shed its skin. Therefore, it was a new birth, it was a new stage, a restoration that was given to the snake. Hence, the snake became the symbol of healing and eternal life.
But for the book of Revelation, the snake is a negative image because it goes back to the Garden of Eden.
It was in the form of a serpent that the devil tempted Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. The Bible depicts Satan as the author of evil and temptation. His name means accuser or opponent. Before he fell, he was one of the highest-ranking angels in heaven, but he, filled with pride, wanted to take the place of God who created him. According to the books of Isaiah and Ezekiel, war broke out in heaven between the angels who rebelled and those who remained faithful to God. Defeated and evicted from the kingdom of heaven, Satan and his fallen angels, banished on earth, did not stop seducing men, pulling them away from God. But after the last judgment, they will be condemned to a terrible fate, that of perpetual death in hell's lake of fire.
Throughout Scripture, then, we see the negative image of the snake and the book of Revelation with the dragon as well. This sort of imagery is a negative one. And so this tension that existed between Jesus as the healer and Asclepius as the healer existed. And so the cult of Asclepius became a great foe of early Christianity in the centuries that followed.
Pergamon, the center of worship for Asclepius and the serpent, already has enough to deserve its satanic reputation. But are there any other practices alluding to Satan's throne in the letter to Pergamon? Determined to understand this mystery, I decide to visit the famous Acropolis. And to get there, I take the cable car. The Acropolis of Pergamon has a royal look. Majestically carved out of the mountain, it dominated the entire region with its splendor.
Well, on the Acropolis, there were three main levels or terraces. The top level that the palaces were located. There was a theater on the side of this that was the steepest theater in the ancient world.
It beheld the largest library in the ancient world, after that of Alexandria.
There was a central terrace, again with temples, other buildings, gymnasia, bath complexes, and then going down into the lower city as well, where there are other religious sanctuaries too.
Among these religious shrines, the most famous was undoubtedly the Great Altar of Pergamon, also known as the Altar of Zeus.
The Altar of Zeus is an extremely important building in the history of Pergamum, which was the place where they made sacrifices almost 24 hours a day. It is not a temple, but rather a place of sacrifice, which is an altar.
Built in the 2nd century BC, this masterpiece of Hellenistic architecture consisted of a monumental staircase that led to a courtyard in which sacrifices were made. The altar was surrounded by the largest marble fresco in the world, representing the victory of the gods of Olympus over giants. This fresco is no longer visible here because in the late 19th century, the altar of Zeus was disassembled and became the focus of a painstaking archaeological reconstruction in Berlin, Germany.
A German railroad engineer by the name of Karl Humann, who comes to Pergamum and he sees some Turkish individuals burning marble fragments, which they did to get lime for building. And they did this all over from these ancient monuments. And he asked the workman, he said, "Where did you get that?" And he pointed to the wall. And sure enough, he looked there and he found all these beautiful pieces that had been broken up but put into the wall. And so he wrote to the Sultan in Istanbul, asked for permission to take these stones out of Turkey.
In 1878, the Ottoman Empire gave Germany permission to excavate the site of Pergamon. And in the following years, a large number of the altar fragments were uncovered and sent to Berlin. Thanks to all these fragments from the site of the Acropolis, a museum honoring Pergamon was opened in 1930, and the Great Altar of Pergamon was the main attraction. The monument is still visible today in Berlin. Strangely enough, its two wings, separated by a monumental staircase, give it the shape of a throne. The similarity is striking. The throne of Satan in the letter to Pergamon could therefore refer to the altar of Zeus. Could the murder of Antipas inside the bull have taken place on this altar? The hypothesis is popular with some specialists, but there is no evidence to back it up. The rest of my ascent brings me to the most prestigious building on the Acropolis. On the highest point was built the Temple of Trajan, erected in the 2nd century AD by the Romans. Its magnificent columns allow us to clearly imagine the splendor of its architecture. This temple was dedicated to the emperor and dominated the entire lower city, serving as Roman propaganda. It thus affirmed the imperial cult in Pergamon in a way unmatched in the whole province of Asia.
And we know from ancient sources that they actually had a facility where families of the elite would gather and they would sing hymns to the emperor as Lord and God and as a divine being. Pergamum then became a center of imperial cult worship very early in the province of Asia.
As I recall the murder of Antipas, I can easily see the influence of imperial worship here, as he was sentenced to death by order of a Roman governor in such an appalling religious ceremony. Pergamon was really the example of the imperial cult that mixed pagan rituals with an extremely powerful political and religious alliance. This alliance of power exercised a very strong grip and domination over the city. And yet this element is particularly denounced by Revelation. In chapter 13 of the book, John uses the image of a beast who receives power and authority through the dragon, representing Satan. But what does this beast represent?
One of the distinctive figures in the book of Revelation is an individual, these beasts that represent the religious and political power on the earth. Now, what's interesting in Revelation, the word Antichrist is never used. In a sense, though, the man of lawlessness that Paul talks about, Antichrist in other texts, and the beast that we see in Revelation represents that type of figure who was against the church.
Many biblical scholars believe that the image of the beast is a direct reference to the worship of the emperor. For who better than Rome and its emperors embodied the image of evil at the time Revelation was written? And this is especially true in Pergamon and in the province of Asia, because it was where Christians were most subject to imperial worship. By this image in Revelation, John alerts Christians to the danger of submitting to and prostrating themselves before the image of the emperor.
For the author of Revelation, this is extremely serious. It is something that puts us out of the communion of the Lord. It is an act of idolatry. It is spiritual adultery. And it is a great difference which is made by the Lord in the letters to the 7 churches between the conquerors on the one hand and the apostates. The conquerors are those who did not bow down before the beast and before his image. That is to say, they did not practice the imperial worship. The apostates are those who let themselves go to that.
And history shows us that the emerging Antichrist figure was first embodied by the emperors who showed the most cruelty towards Christians. The first one to do this was the Emperor Nero.
It is believed that the figure who will forge this incarnation of evil is indeed that of Emperor Nero. The image of a cruel demonic emperor somewhere is an image that is already circulating as a sort of literary figure that is widespread in the Roman world. And the Christians, probably who also knew this Roman culture, take up this motive, and so Nero becomes this incarnation of evil because already had this reputation that was sulfurous in the Roman world.
The figure of the Antichrist is an anonymous figure in the book of Revelation, and readers have always tried to give it a name. All the figures that were considered to be demonic, the name was appended to the beast or the Antichrist. It is, if you will, an available figure.
Certainly we can look in history and see various figures who represent this beastly Antichrist figure, and they all are characterized by similar things. They try and suppress the scriptures. cause worship to them rather than to the true God. All of them have these similarities, take worship away from the true God to human personalities.
The dictator Adolf Hitler was doubtless the most obvious Antichrist-like figure in modern history. He was strongly influenced by the imperialism of the Roman emperors, and his appreciation of the ancient monuments encouraged him to take a keen interest in the Great Altar of Pergamon, on display in Berlin. His favorite architect, Albert Speer, was directly inspired by the altar of Zeus when building the huge stage for Nazi Party rallies in Nuremberg. This was aimed at propaganda and mass indoctrination. It was intended to give the impression of grandeur, strength, and power. Searchlights created the illusion of pillars and a temple of light during nighttime gatherings. The meeting there had a distinct religious overtone. He himself embodied a type of messianic figure who would save the people.
The politician who wants to legitimize his absolute seizure of power can only do so if he affirms, 1, that the nation is in danger, and that 2, he is the only possible saving figure. It's just a religious speech.
But Nazi megalomania plunged humanity into atrocities. Racism and anti-Semitic hatred resulted in the Holocaust of 6 million Jews. Unfortunately, it was from this raised platform that the Nuremberg Laws of September 13, 1935 were proclaimed, legitimatizing and legalizing the persecution and prosecution of Jews in Germany and paving the way for the atrocity of the Shoah. Was Hitler fully aware of the symbolism of the Great Altar of Pergamon that he embraced? Or did he do so just by chance? The question remains open, as do questions about the spiritual influences that lie behind such powers. So Pergamon was the center of occult power at the time. The worship of deities such as Asclepius and the serpent ritual, human sacrifices on the high altar, the supremacy of imperial worship allied with other pagan practices. All this made the city of Pergamon one of the most dangerous places for Christians. My visit to Pergamon helped me understand that beyond physical persecution, spiritual oppression persists, which Christians are called to discern. The Apostle Paul wrote in the epistles to the Ephesians that believers had not to fight against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. The letter to the Church of Pergamon encouraged Christians who, like Antipas, persevered in faith and prayer in the face of human and spiritual hostilities in this city. The example of their perseverance under persecution requires deeper contemplation. Christian persecution has unfortunately been a part of history since the beginning. But what about today? Are there Christians still killed or persecuted for their faith? Open Doors is an international NGO which supports Christians persecuted or deprived of religious freedoms around the world. The former director of Open Doors France, Michel Varton, shares the current situation with me.
In 73 countries around the world today, Christians are persecuted for their faith. 73 countries. That's practically a third of the countries of the world. I can go further. 1 in 9 Christians in the world today are persecuted for their faith. Over 245 million Christians. So it has become a worldwide phenomenon. At Open Doors, to try to understand the persecution, in fact, we analyze 5 areas of life. And we are not only look at the persecution, which is the violent persecution, murders, assassinations, rapes, people beaten, attacks on churches, but also daily pressure. In fact, we are talking about 2 things: the hammer persecution, which is violence, and the vice persecution, which is everyday pressure. The persecution is always a choice. If you don't want to be persecuted, it is very easy. Don't tell anyone you're a Christian. Don't live your faith in front of your neighbors. Keep everything to yourself. Don't go to church on Sunday morning, and you'll be left alone. And every Christian must make this choice. And in countries where you don't have the right to live your faith freely, it requires a choice to follow Jesus.
The danger in the West, let's say the countries where we can live very peacefully, is to settle down and consider that the comfort, the protection of God is ultimately a kind of Jew. And it is very dangerous because we no longer have the habit, the concept, the understanding that the gospel is also to join Christ in his sufferings.
This is what the Lord asks: remain faithful until death. It takes faith, it takes a commitment, a firm conviction to stay with the Lord. There's a verse at the end of the letter of the Colossians. Paul, who is in prison at the time, and he finished his letter, he said, "I, Paul, am writing to you. Don't forget that I am in chains." When Paul says, "Remember my chains," he is saying, don't forget that walking with Jesus comes with a price to pay. Jesus said, if they persecuted me, they will persecute you too. You cannot imagine you will live without problems when you follow the Son of God who was persecuted to death.
Persecution is a terrible reality, inherent in the Christian faith, which affects many believers in many countries around the world. The book of Revelation reveals the reality of evil that causes persecution, and it calls on believers to fight a spiritual battle. The example set by the apostles Paul and John, and the martyrs Polycarp and Antipas, reveal men of incredible faithfulness who were not afraid to suffer for their faith, even to the point of accepting chains or death if necessary. The letters to the churches and the whole book of Revelation resonate as a tremendous encouragement, a strong call to believers to become victorious. The victory described in the book of Revelation is not a promise for the believer to escape the test before them, but to face it head on with faithfulness and courage, rooted firmly in their first love of Christ. I now better understand the immeasurable value of the message that this book contains for all generations of oppressed believers who go through times of fire. Behold, I am coming soon, are the words of Christ at the end of the book of Revelation, promising his return to his beloved church. Could this promise be for our generation? Will we live through these prophecies at the end of times? Will we be prepared to stand firm in these times of fire? In search of answers to these deep mysteries, I continue my investigation with the next 4 churches of Revelation. I will discover the additional dangers described in the letters addressed to these churches. My quest will lead me in the footsteps of the evil prophetess Jezebel, who seduced the church of Thyatira. Uncover the dead church of Sardis, the victorious church of Philadelphia, and dive deeper into the lukewarm church of Laodicea.